speaking with a civil rights activist, a community poet, and a public health advocate, and I must say also a dear friend. Please help me in welcoming Miss Peggy Trotter Dammond Preacely. How are you, Peggy?
I'm fine, thanks, Derek.
It's been a while since we've talked and seen each other, and as I was doing my homework for this particular interview, I must say I learned a lot about you that I didn't know.
Really?
And the more I read, the more I thought, wow, what was I missing all that time? Because we were so immersed in the work of the community and doing what we did, working together. But your work started long ago in terms of the community at the age of 15 when you began working in the civil rights movement. Can you begin by sharing what prompted that and what that was like at such a young age?
Sure. I grew up in Harlem, New York. I was born in Pittsburgh, and I was raised by parents that always felt that we should have service to our community and to uplift ourselves and help others. So when 1955 came and the killing of Emmett Till and all of the lynchings and things that were going on in the South, those of us that were living in the North, we felt we had to do something. So we started picketing Woolworths, and we started being in support of what some of the activities were in the South. And my family was also a reason why I became an early activist. My great-great-grandmother and grandfather were escaped slaves from Macon, Georgia in 1848, and they escaped on the Underground Railroad. Okay. And my great-uncle, William Monroe Trotter, in 1906 founded a liberation newspaper in Boston and actually chained himself to the theater to protest Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's film. So I guess you would say it was in my blood to be a part of the protest movement.
Really? So quickly then, when you go back to the Underground Railroad, for instance, I was just back in my hometown of Mobile, Alabama, and I was at the red light, and when I looked over to the side, there was a plaque on a little wall saying that was the last slave market, and that was where the slave ship Clotilda landed, which was the last slave ship to come into the United States.
Oh, I didn't know the last one.
Yeah, it was on a bet that the captain could get around the security and take one last load of slaves. So how did you find out that history about your family from the Underground Railroad? Because I know, unless it's an oral history for many families, it's often not captured. I can't go back far, for instance, in my own family. How did you get that?
That's a good question, because it really did make a difference that once William and Ellen escaped from Macon, Georgia, they went through Philadelphia and to Boston. And then in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, so the slave catchers came after them to Boston. And at that point, they had barely learned to read and write. They were house slaves. One was a carpenter, and my great-grandmother was sold as a wedding present to the daughter of her father, because my great-great-great-grandmother was from Mali, and she was... then the daughter was the illegitimate daughter of the slave owner. So she didn't have to work in the fields, but she was a house servant, but they still were not allowed to read and write. So they were ferreted on the Underground Railroad all the way to Halifax, Nova Scotia, about 1850. And from there they went to England. And in England they became part of the abolitionist movement. So... and once they learned to read and write, they wrote their story down. And I have the book, which is called Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom by William Craft. So when I was about 7 years old, my mother, Ellen Craft Dammond, who was named after my great-great-grandmother, began to read to my brother and myself the story of how our ancestors escaped. So I'm an oral historian, and I teach families.
I'm sitting here listening to you. It's like you got the dates and all the details.
Well, I just love to have families interview their elders so that they can learn their stories. And I was fortunate enough to be able to read that. In addition, William Grant Still's The Underground Railroad book was one of the first books that when I was 7 years old, my mother had me begin to read. And those are the collected stories of others who escaped on the Underground Railroad. So, you know, I just feel as if each person and each family has a story. We were just fortunate that ours was written down and that we could learn about it when we were so young.
Yeah, it's disappointing to me, again, making it personal, that. I know that my great-great-great-grandfather on my mom's side was a white Irish slave. People think about slavery, but they don't always think about there were different kinds of slaves that came here. So if we fast forward then from that time frame up until the 50s and the 60s, and then you find yourself doing a sit-in in North Carolina and Maryland. What was that like? And what
I first became a freedom rider on the eastern shore of Maryland after I went to jail in 1961 in Cambridge, Maryland. We had a sit-in because we wanted to test that, black and white weren't allowed to sit together. And that was my first time in jail. And it was pretty scary and pretty powerful because we were fasting for 5 days. And when you fast, your mind kind of gets sort of loopy. But we decided that we would do that after we were arrested in Crisfield, Maryland. And many people don't know that the eastern shore of Maryland is one of the most racist places back in the 50s and 60s.
Wow.
Maryland itself has a long history. So we stayed 5 days in jail at Christmas. We got arrested Christmas Eve. So we spent Christmas in jail, and we won over our jailers because we sang freedom songs, and the jailers couldn't shut us up. And as the community came to sing underneath our jail cell to keep our spirits up, they would leave, and then about 1 o'clock in the morning, we would hear the jailers singing the freedom songs.
Oh, wow.
And so, as you know, nonviolence was about changing things from a nonviolent perspective. And in those days, this was the early days of the civil rights movement. It was very much a part of what we were taught by Reverend James Lawson, and who followed Gandhi.
Right, and I noticed that in talking about the early days, there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or
SNCC.
SNCC.
Yes.
And for those who don't know what SNCC is, explain.
In 1960, there were 4 men who sat in Greensboro, North Carolina, and out of that came the formation of many students from around the country. We gathered in Raleigh, North Carolina at Shaw University, and we founded SNCC. We were led by Ella Baker, the grand community organizer, and one of my dear friends and a leader. I knew her in Harlem and ran into her through SNCC. So SNCC was the young people's movement, kind of similar to Black Lives Matter today, in contrast to the SCLC, which was Dr. King's group. So we were the young radicals. We were the ones that you couldn't shut up and that told us, and we said, we want direct action and we want it now.
Now, there was another element, as you say that, I would imagine, and you can correct me here. Where did Malcolm X and his involvement, you talk about Dr. King and SNCC and everything else, did those paths ever cross or that philosophy?
Yes. Well, I used to listen to Malcolm on the street corner of 7th Avenue and 135th Street.
Wow.
Before he became a Muslim. And, of course, his incredible rhetoric and personality attracted us. And many of us listened to him and then later understood that he spoke in a more extreme way so that some of the things that Dr. King and other civil rights leaders would sound more acceptable. And Malcolm was a genius and also in his conversion when he began to say that he was interested in good people all over and not just black people. And I was living in Boston when he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom and had been there many times. So even though I did meet him and shook his hand, he was not a personal friend or colleague the way Dr. King was later for me.
Now, I was going to ask you that question because you talk about people like James Farmer and Ella Baker and Dr. King, and you attended, trainings with some.
Yes.
Can you share how you got to those and what came out of it?
Well, as I mentioned, Reverend James Lawson, who actually has been my pastor here in Los Angeles at Holman United Methodist Church, where I attend, he went to India and studied under Gandhi, and he came back and taught Dr. King the nonviolent activities that were followed by the Shanti Sena, which were the peace forces of the Indians that fought the British. And Reverend Lawson taught at Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, and that was a hotbed, you would say, of liberals, both black and white, in the 50s and the 60s. They also had been a part of the labor movement and working with the farmers. So I was privileged to go to those trainings, and in order to be in SNCC, you had to, in 1960, you had to agree to be nonviolent. So we had to be trained not to react when they spit on us or burned us or shouted or did any of the other things, because the movement, the early movement, and we can talk about what happened later too, was you had to make a commitment to nonviolence. So that's where we learned nonviolent training.
Do you find that, because I didn't know that tidbit about Dr. Lawson and how he introduced that concept to Dr. King.
Yes.
Do you find that that's generally known when that story is told, or is that a piece of the story that people need to be reminded of, in the sense of how the nonviolence movement got its roots?